Hello crafty friend, this is Juliana Michaels and I want to welcome you to my channel. In this video, I'm sharing how I created this Christmas banner for the Tim Holtz Sizzix Christmas 2023 Live. I'm going to share the highlights on how I created the various pieces and at the end show you how these same steps can be used to create a card if banners aren't your thing. If you're interested in the supplies I've used, you can find links to them in the description box below. When you shop through those links, it supports me, and I really do appreciate that so very much. A blog post is also available with written instructions and more photos, and you can find a link to that in the description box below. Now let's get on with the making. Off camera, I used the Santa Greetings Colorize Thinlits die set and cut out the various pieces from colored cardstock. I used 3 shades of red, a pink, cream, white, black, and green. The black has an adhesive sheet adhered to it to make adhering those layers a little bit easier. You could certainly do that with all of the layers if you prefer that sort of adhesive. You'll just need to be cautious when it comes time to drying the paper so that you don't melt the adhesive. Next, I'm going to add some interest to the die cuts using Distress Oxide inks and the ink smushing technique. The colors I'm using are Lost Shadow, Bundled Sage, Worn Lipstick, and Aged Mahogany. To help me figure out what colors I wanted to use, I took the scraps from the die cutting and tested various colors to see how they would work. Because of the nature of oxide inks becoming a little chalky when water is added to them, I have found it's helpful to test the color on the colored cardstock to see if it's going to show up or not. I seem to get a more obvious effect when I use a lighter or darker ink as compared to the cardstock color. So for example, I found Aged Mahogany to be a good option for the red layers. For this technique, all you do is smush the ink pad onto a craft mat, spritz it with a little water, and then smush the cardstock into the ink. You repeat the smushing until you achieve the amount of coverage that you would like, and then you can use your heat tool to dry the paper. On the Santa, I didn't do the center area because that's going to be covered up by other layers, so why waste the ink? I then repeated the ink smushing with the other layers. For the smaller pieces, a pair of tweezers came in handy to help smush the paper into the ink, but it was especially helpful so that I didn't burn my fingers when I was using the heat tool to dry the paper. I used this exact technique to add interest to the die cuts in my recent Halloween banner, but I wanted to share it again for those of you who might be interested in the colors I used or happen to miss my Halloween banner video. I'll have it linked below if you'd like to check it out. Before moving on to the next color, make sure to clean off your craft mat, especially when you move onto lighter colored cardstock. There's nothing worse than getting red ink all over your white cardstock beard and having to recut everything. I'm just saying. Here I'm moving onto the beard and the coat and hat trim, and I'm using Lost Shadow for the ink smushing. I went with a much lighter ink here because I didn't want there to be too much color on the white areas. After ink smushing the bottom layer, I place the next layer over it to make sure I'm getting the ink in the areas that will actually show. Next, I moved on to the black layers, which include the belt and boots, and I used Lost Shadow for those layers as well. The mittens were next, and I applied Bundled Sage to those. Last but not least was the pink for Santa's face. I used Worn Lipstick Distress Oxide for these layers. And because the cheek pieces were so tiny, I used a small paintbrush to apply the ink. Once all of the pieces were inked and dried, I assembled the Santa using Distress Collage Medium, but feel free to use your choice of adhesive. If you've never used a colorized die, when you die cut the bottom layers, they are embossed for the layer that goes on top of them. You can then use this to help line up the various layers as you assemble the die cut. Here's a look at the fully assembled Santa. To add a bit more interest, I used a small brush to add a little more of the Lost Shadow Distress Oxide ink to the beard and trim. To make the belt stand out a little more, I inked the edges with Lost Shadow Oxide ink. I also lightly inked the edges of the white layers with vintage photo distress ink before I adhered them to the Santa, and then I inked the edges of the entire die cut as well. Now I'm going to repeat the same process for the trees. Off camera, I used the Trim a Tree Thinlits die set to cut the various layers from colored cardstock. I used 2 shades of green for the tree. To make assembly easier for the ornaments and stars, I adhered an adhesive sheet to the back side of the cardstock and then die cut them. I used 2 shades of red, 2 shades of purple, 2 shades of teal, and 2 shades of yellow, and then a silver for the base of the ornaments. You might look at this tree and think it's really tall and too big for your project. In fact, they are too tall as is for my banner. But Tim, in his brilliance, made it super easy to trim the tree and make it shorter. Each of the trees has a section on them that is partially die cut. All you have to do is take a pair of scissors and trim off that last bit where the paper is still connected, and voila, you have trimmed the tree. So now that my tree is trimmed, I'm going to add the ink smushing detail with bundled sage Distress Oxide ink. I'll repeat this for each layer and use my heat tool to dry the paper. Before I assembled the trees, I inked the edges with Vintage Photo Distress ink for a little distress. If you want the trees to look more dimensional, I recommend only applying the adhesive to the very top of the tree layers. Then once the glue is dry, you can lift and curl up the layers to give it a more realistic effect. Here's a look at the assembled tree. Off camera, I used scattered straw when I ink smushed the star layers, and I inked the edges of the assembled stars with Vintage Photo Distress ink. Originally, I wasn't going to include the tree trunk, but once I had the tree assembled, I decided to add them. I die cut them from 2 shades of brown cardstock and ink smushed them into brushed corduroy Distress Oxide ink, and then inked the edges with Vintage Photo Distress ink. Also off camera, I assembled the ornaments and inked the edges with Vintage Photo Distress ink. To create the base for the banner, I'm going to use the Woodgrain 3D embossing folder to add some texture. I cut 5 pieces of craft heavy stock to 4 by 6 inches, and I'll also be using walnut stain and ground espresso Distress Oxide inks. Before I emboss the paper, I lightly spritz them with water using my distress sprayer 2 times on each side. I'm going to do this off camera though, so I don't get water everywhere. I then place the paper inside the embossing folder and close it. I place the embossing folder at a slight angle on the cutting pad and with the open side towards the center and run it through my die cutting machine. I've found that with these thicker folders that placing it this way helps it go through the machine a little easier. I have my hand on the top of it as it's moving through just so it doesn't shoot out too fast while I'm filming. And here's a look at the amazing wood grain texture you achieve with this folder. Next, I took the walnut stain Distress Oxide ink pad and rubbed it over the surface of the embossed paper. I'm just trying to hit the raised areas with the ink. To add some interest, I spritzed the paper with water by slowly pulling the trigger on my distress sprayer to get larger water droplets, and then I used my heat tool to dry the paper. Once it was dry, I then added some areas of ground espresso to the paper to add some depth and interest. I spritz the paper again and then dry it with my heat tool. I then inked the edges with walnut stain Distress Oxide ink. I then repeated this process for the remaining 4 panels. To create the trim piece on each panel, I used the Decorative Trims die set. I used the longest scallop die to cut 3 pieces of dark red cardstock and 2 pieces of green cardstock. I ink smushed the red pieces into aged mahogany ink and the green into bundled sage, just like I did earlier with the other die cuts. I then inked the edges with walnut stain Distress Oxide ink. Here's a look at the completed banner. Each panel is 4 1/4 by 6 1/4 inches. I cut a piece of white cardstock to that size and then inked the edges with Vintage Photo Distress ink. Next, I adhered the wood grain panel and added the trim along the bottom. I then added some machine stitching around the outer edge of the panel. To turn these into a banner, I added eyelets to the top left and right corner of each panel using a crocodile. For the ribbon, I cut a length of seam binding and dyed it using Distress Spray Stain in lumberjack plaid and aged mahogany. The word panels were created using the Big Tidings Thinlits die set. I used the same ink smushing technique on them that I used on the Santa and trees. I then adhered the various die cuts to the panels using double-sided foam adhesive to add a little more dimension. Now, if banners aren't your thing, you could easily take these same techniques and use them to create a card. Here's a card I created using these techniques with the Santa Greetings die set. But for the card, I added the banner that comes with the die set. You could also add a stamped sentiment to make things come together a little faster. And there you go. I hope you enjoyed seeing how this Christmas banner and Christmas card came together using the Tim Holtz Sizzix Christmas 2023 release, and that it inspires you as you begin your holiday making. Until next time, stay crafty, my friend. Thanks so much for watching. I'm truly grateful for you. I was wondering if you could do me a quick favor and subscribe to my channel or leave me a thumbs up or a comment. If you're feeling extra generous, I'd love for you to share about my channel with your friends. All of these things help out us YouTubers so much, and it would mean so much to me to have your support.